What's up, everybody? It's your boy Tru Element 78 in the building with.
Your one and only reigning and defending Mondo Lucha Hall of Famer, the X-Man Xavier Mustafa.
And bringing up the rear, like the brake man for the Jamaican bobsled team, I am the natural Chris Black.
And today you're tuned into a very special edition of the Saturday Night Slamcasters. We are here today to review the first and second episodes of Dark Side of the Viceland's Dark Side of the Rings, Season 2. And episodes 1 and 2 both covered the life and times and the tragedy of former WWE superstar Chris Benoit. The episode was entitled Benoit Parts 1 and 2. So they aired it as a two-part episode, but we're going to cover episode 1 and episode 2 today on this show. And just let me exhale really quick because this is one of the heaviest documentaries that I've ever seen, and I've watched stuff about the Holocaust and World War II and World War I and Vietnam, but it was just some very heavy material, mainly due to the fact, for those of you who don't know, that Chris Benoit was a WWE superstar. He was also in WCW. He was in ECW. He wrestled over in Japan, and he had two marriages, but his second marriage obviously ended in tragedy, where he murdered his wife, his young son, and himself over the course of a weekend. And so that's what this documentary covered. But they gave a lot of background on not just Chris Benoit, but on his relationships with other wrestlers, specifically former WWE superstar Eddie Guerrero, who also had wrestled in WCW and ECW with Chris Benoit. And also it covered the life of his wife, whose life he took in this tragedy, Nancy Benoit, who had wrestled in WCW and other territories back in the day. So, yeah, we're going to just jump right into it, and I'm going to turn it over to the natural Chris Black and what he thought, and at least about episode 1, and we'll move over and transition into episode 2 once we get there.
All right, so I've been watching the series week by week as the episodes have been coming out. And before I had watched episode 1, I was reading everyone on social media talking about how heavy this was, and what kind of human are you if you don't feel something. And I have to admit, now I watched it twice. I watched it again today. Both times, I will admit, I teared up because I put myself in the shoes of a Chris Benoit, and I think of like the two closest guys in the business to me have been Xavier Mustafa and TC Washington. And I can only imagine what it would be like if I go to their hotel room, they're on the bathroom floor, gurgling and die in my arms. Like that hit me pretty hard. I really enjoyed episode 1 because it gave you a lot of background information as to where Benoit's head was going into the situation that he found himself in. They did an excellent job. Viceland has really outdone themselves on this one. I absolutely love episode 1. Strong recommend for anyone, wrestling fan or not.
So for me, heavy isn't even a word to describe these two shows. I mean, I don't think I've ever watched anything and the entire episode I had tears in my eyes. Like, they were lighter at some parts, they were heavy at other parts, but yeah, the whole, I don't know how much we want to get into it, but yeah, the whole him finding Eddie Guerrero and his reaction to losing his best buddy in the building, his best buddy in the world, and it was just, hit me in the heart, pulled the heartstrings, if you will.
So this episode, or should I say the first two episodes, they pretty much featured the same cast of characters throughout. You had interviews with Chavo Guerrero, who was Eddie Guerrero's cousin, and also a wrestler himself who had performed with um, Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, Chris Jericho, who was also a part of the documentary. You also had Dean Malenko was featured in the documentary, who was also a wrestler who had wrestled with them, obviously. You had Dean Malenko's wife. You had Sandy, who was Nancy's sister, and you also had David Benoit, who was Chris Benoit's son from his first marriage, featured in the documentary. And so since it was from his first marriage, it was obviously his older son. And watching this documentary just really took me back to where I was when I first heard the news that Chris Benoit died. But even more than that, it took me back to where I was when I heard Eddie Guerrero had passed, since we'll start it chronologically like they did in the documentary. They started off talking about Chris Benoit and his intensity and his time wrestling in Canada, and eventually going over to Japan and wrestling as White Pegasus and having a series of matches with Chris Jericho, and just how strong style wrestling was back in the day, where like there were punches were still pulled, but not to the degree of that they are today. So you had matches where Chris Jericho was wrestling as, I believe it was not Chris Jericho, Eddie Guerrero as Black Tiger the second or Black Tiger 2, and then him and Chris Benoit just had strong style matches over there in Japan, tearing it up every night. And they were talking about how Chris Benoit would talk about, man, I hate wrestling this Eddie Guerrero guy, he's an asshole or whatever, but they just created a rapport and a friendship that carried on throughout their careers. And so they came from Japan and went to ECW together, and then from ECW they went over to WCW and just built this bond that a lot of people would argue was the downfall and the breaking point for Chris Benoit when Eddie Guerrero passed away. But before we get into that, we'll just follow along with Chris Benoit's career. They mainly focused on his time when he did come over to WCW, and he began wrestling a program with another wrestler by the name of Kevin Sullivan. And let me throw this out there. I'm glad that we waited instead of jumping on the bandwagon of a lot of other podcasts and recording a review right away, because Kevin Sullivan, and I mentioned this on a podcast a couple of months ago when they were talking about the Viceland series coming out and Kevin Sullivan's involvement, which I was never made aware of, that he had ever been a suspect in the death of the Benoit family. That was news to me when they were filming this documentary. And like I said, we brought that up on a podcast, that was never one of the rumors I had heard. And we'll get into some of the rumors and hearsay that I had heard growing up until, the truth was finally revealed. But for this documentary, Kevin Sullivan had declined to appear on camera, and there were claims made in here that he had abused his ex-wife, which had become Nancy Benoit, because Kevin Sullivan and Nancy had a relationship from NWA to WCW. In WCW, Kevin Sullivan was the booker, and a lot of people always said that Kevin Sullivan booked his own divorce, where he made a storyline where him and Chris Benoit were pretty much fighting over the love of Nancy Benoit, and eventually, obviously, Chris Benoit won her affection. But with him saying he didn't want to appear on camera, and the only comment making is that he denied all abuse allegations made against him, a lot of people said, well, that's kind of suspicious. Why doesn't he want to appear? And a lot of other podcasts jumped on doing the reviews, and a lot of people brought that up and wish they could hear that side of the story. And lucky for us, Jim Cornette decided to actually have a sit down with Kevin Sullivan, because they had a relationship spanning over 40 years. So he was able to get him on his show a couple of weeks ago and get his side of the story. And he said the main reason he didn't want to appear on the documentary is that he didn't really understand what the documentary was, but also he didn't want to insinuate anything or, talk bad about the dead and somebody who couldn't defend themselves and place them in a bad light. And also he didn't want to disrespect the family and those who are still alive. And I can understand that. I know we talked about it on a podcast after it happened a few weeks back and just gave our thoughts about how it was kind of dry, but at the end of the day, that pretty much sums up what Kevin Sullivan said. And the only abuse allegation that's out there was abuse from Nancy to Kevin Sullivan. He did put that out there. He said that was one of the reasons that he didn't want to appear on camera to throw that out there, but that's the only record of any abuse. But in this documentary, you had um, Sandy, who was Nancy's sister, saying that she had seen her with the black eye, and Dean Malenko's wife saying she had seen Nancy with a black eye, and that whenever she would get into a fight with Kevin Sullivan, she would run to Chris Benoit, and Chris Benoit kind of became her protector. And then, like I said, they say that Kevin Sullivan booked his own divorce, and Nancy and Chris Benoit fell in love. Chris Benoit was married at the time, but going through a rough patch, divorced that wife, and eventually married Nancy. Of course, in that first marriage, he had the son, David Benoit, but with Nancy, he had another son by the name of Daniel Benoit. I feel like I'm talking a lot. But actually, Chris Black, you want to jump in?
All right, so where you left off?
Yeah.
All right, so like once Nancy and Benoit started to seek better opportunities away from WCW, she decided that she wanted to focus more on building a family with Benoit. So she kind of stepped out of the limelight so that Benoit can, live his dream in the WWE. One thing that I really enjoyed about Benoit, again, I really wasn't a WCW guy, but I do remember that him and Booker T had that amazing Best of 7 series. And what I've always liked about Benoit was his explosiveness. Now, I've said that quite a few times on this podcast. That is one of the most key elements to any pro wrestler. If I was to put my top 10 favorite matches, Benoit versus Kurt Angle at the Royal Rumble, I think it was 2001, where Kurt Angle beat him in a submission. That was probably one of my favorite, like I said, best of 10 matches. They really, really hit hard how Eddie Guerrero and Benoit became very, very close during this period. Well, because they've been up and down the roads, they've been in Japan, they went to WCW. They had to fight over the same things with size and not being the biggest guys, and only the bigger guys got pushed. So again, they wanted to seek opportunity elsewhere. Eddie was more of a religious guy. Benoit was not. So Eddie kind of introduced him to religion, and again, that just solidified the bond that they had. Now, this part I kind of forgot happened because there must have been a lot going on in WWE, but Eddie Guerrero apparently left or got fired due to showing up high. And I think they said that just Chris Jericho was talking about how back then wrestlers, and even today, wrestlers don't try to admit that they're hurt. They want to just kind of power through it. It's kind of like I don't want to say a macho thing, but you don't want to lose your spot. So Eddie had some nagging injuries. Add that to the rock star lifestyle that most professional wrestlers back then had. Drinking, drugs. Not Nancy. Vicky tells the story of how Eddie Guerrero OD'd 3 times in the house. And the interesting thing was, after the 3rd time, she said she just left him and took the kids to school. Like, fuck it. If you're going to take him, God, take him now. Thankfully, he didn't die. But again, he got fired for showing up high. But then there was a period where Benoit was gone. I mean, not Benoit, Guerrero was gone. I didn't realize that, I guess, thinking back. But he did return. And then they started talking about the WrestleMania 20 wins with Benoit and Eddie Guerrero. I think that was one of the most powerful endings to a WrestleMania. The most, how can I put this? You really felt it because they both were, if you knew the journey that both guys had been on, like it was a culmination of years and years of hard work, and they really was emotional and they showed it. It was like I said, probably the most powerful ending of any WrestleMania. I don't want to hog the limelight. Mustafa, what you got?
Well, I don't know. I feel like we're kind of going scene by scene for this thing, but the thing that kind of stood out to me is kind of how, now I may be merging the 2 episodes together, but when he started talking about his situation, like with CTE, and that his brain was like that of like a kid, I think it was, or old. No, I'm sorry, old man. And, they brought Christopher Lewinsky in and had him talk about that, that stuff because he had his concussions in the WWE. Am I too far ahead?
Yeah. You jumping. I'll hop back in real quick. Well, all right. So you left off where with Eddie Guerrero. So
WrestleMania 20.
yeah. So times were going very well for Chris Benoit and Eddie Guerrero. They were riding high after that WrestleMania, and they continued to push themselves in the ring, continued to push wrestling forward, still putting on amazing matches and everything. And I believe it was a tour that they were doing. I did not write it down where they
Texas.
were. Was it was
Oh no.
No, the Texas loop was a different one. Yeah. But anyways, they were on the road. They had to go do a show. Chris Benoit and Chavo Guerrero and Eddie Guerrero, they had all checked into their hotel. It was like, hey, I'll see you guys in the morning. They were all planning to go hit the gym like they normally do. Chavo went to his room. Everybody went to their own room. Eventually in the morning, I guess the front desk called Chavo's room saying, hey, something's going on with your cousin. We can't get a hold of him. And so he's like, what do you mean we can't get a hold of him? So he had a wake up call. And so he goes up to the room and there's hotel management already up there. The lock is locked from the inside of the room, so they had to cut the bolt. And they went in there, and this was the first time I had ever heard that when Eddie Guerrero was discovered in his hotel room, he was still alive. And Chavo said he goes in, he's laying flat on his stomach in the bathroom with his toothbrush, and he turns him over and he's like telling him stay with him and everything, and he could just feel the life leave his body as it turned cold, and he knew that he wasn't there anymore. And he said then he gets a phone call from Chris Benoit like, hey, I'm downstairs, where are you guys at? And for Chris Benoit's pretty much entire wrestling career, they had always said he was one of those people that didn't really express any emotion at all, and you never saw him cry. Like, if he made a mistake, Chris Jericho talks about how they had a match and he botched a move, and he went and he like would punish himself with like these squats. He went into the locker room and Chris Benoit was like
500.
Yeah, doing these squats, and he's like, why are you doing those squats? He's like, I messed up out there in the ring, so I got to do this. And he's like, why? Like, you just missed a move. He's like, it was just his coping mechanism. All he knew was work, which we'll get into later. Yeah, which we'll get into later when William Regal made a statement about all he knew was work. But anyways, Chris Benoit calls Chavo. Chavo says, hey, are you sitting down? And he's like, yeah, what's going on? And he tells him that Eddie is gone. And he said, this man let out one of the loudest, like, whelps that you ever heard. Like, it was just like an animal scolded in the woods. Like, and you never expected to get that type of emotion out of someone like Chris Benoit. And he just was so heartbroken over the passing of Eddie Guerrero. And Chris Jericho talks about at the funeral that he sees Chris and he gives him a hug, and the tears that he's crying just soaked through his suit jacket and onto the shirt that he was wearing. That Chris Benoit was completely like devastated by this death, and everybody in the documentary pretty much says he was never the same after that. And they even talk about how Vicky Guerrero, if it hadn't been for Nancy, she doesn't think she could have probably have made it after Eddie Guerrero's passing, because she didn't leave her house or leave her room or her bed and had stopped taking care of herself. And it was Nancy who came in and was like, no, you got to get out of bed, you got to shower, you still got 2 little girls that are depending on you, and help pull her out of the funk. And so Nancy and Chris would come over to try to help out the Guerreros.
They actually stayed for a month.
Yeah,
they stayed for.
Yeah, but they would also find Chris in Vicky and Eddie's bed, and he'd be laying in Eddie's spot and hung his pillows and just weeping, or they would find him in the gym that Eddie had in his house, and the daughters would go and tell Vicky, "Hey, Uncle Chris is upstairs crying again." Like, he was just devastated. And eventually, what kind of helped him out of the funk was they said they bought him a journal that he would start writing in to seem like he was writing to Eddie Guerrero, and they said that kind of helped him pull himself out of the funk because he had started to just cut everyone off and like keep to himself. And he had even become paranoid, kind of, where he started looking at stories of wrestlers' children who had disappeared, and so he started taking one car to the arena and a different car to leave, and going out back doors and side doors and different things like that. Just, I guess, feeling like he was being stalked, and maybe that it was some type of conspiracy possibly for Eddie Guerrero's passing. I'm going to pass it off to someone else who wants to take the hot mic.
Well, I don't know about conspiracy. I know that paranoia, I guess, when you're cycling, I don't know too much about steroids. I know they talk about that more heavily in episode 2, but it could be the steroids that had him. That combined with the loss of Eddie, kind of had his head really screwed up, because that's weird that you're taking side doors and taking, separate routes home and just being really unpredictable. That would have raised a couple flags with a few people, but again, he was such a withdrawn person, and with the death of Eddie, he was even more withdrawn, even more so to the point where, people weren't able to find him in the locker room. He kind of disassociated himself from everybody else. Man. So at this point, they were saying how Nancy was encouraging Chris to kind of get out the business because everything reminded him of Eddie. And Jericho was saying that whenever he would go, or was it Chavo? He said whenever they go to a new arena, he'd be like, "Man, the last time I was in, Texas, Eddie was here. Man, the last time I was in Wisconsin, Eddie was here." So it was almost like he was torturing himself constantly, with the thoughts of Eddie Guerrero. So towards the end of the episode, they talk about how Chavo got a phone call from Chris on Saturday because they had a show in Texas, and he was like, "Nancy and Daniel has food poisoning, so I'm not going to make it today." And they're like, "Okay, well, the pay-per-view is tomorrow night." He was like, "Yeah. I'll see you then." So at the end of the phone conversation, he was like, "Hey, Chavo, I love you, man." And again, red flags if that's something that someone just doesn't normally say. And then in the middle of the night, he received a text first from Chris Benoit saying the dogs are in the enclosed area, the back door's open. And then shortly afterwards, he get the exact same text from Nancy. And Chavo was just like, "What the hell is going on here?" Later, he found out I forgot who he was traveling with, but he asked him, "Did you get a weird text yesterday?"
It was Jean
And he was like,
Laurinaitis.
"Yeah." John Lauren, huh?
Yeah, he said it was Johnny Ace.
Oh, okay. Yeah, he talked to him, and he was like, "Yeah, that's weird, No, it wasn't Johnny Ace, because when he told Johnny Ace, he was like, "Why didn't you tell me this?"
Yeah, that was the third person he showed. Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, the episode kind of ends with the death. Did they?
It doesn't matter where they cut it off. We could just make it see. Part one.
Well,
Let me ask.
Part one.
Let me ask you guys a question before we move forward. Let me ask you guys a question because it's something I skipped. So what I found interesting was that Benoit was influenced by this guy called the Dynamite Kid. Now, I'm curious, what do you guys feel about this guy? Because I have my feelings about him personally, or I don't know him personally, but from what I learned about this guy that I don't like. What are you guys' thoughts of Dynamite Kid?
Nothing special to me. I mean, he was all right as a wrestler.
No, I heard he was.
I don't really know much about him, so
I heard he was a dirtbag in real life, like to the point where
there's a lot of wrestlers that are. So it wouldn't surprise me. Listen, in wrestling, there is no gray area. Either you are an asshole or you're the coolest person on earth. Nobody really rides that middle.
Okay. Well, I was just curious what you guys thought if y'all shared my hatred for this man.
Now, all I've ever really heard is how much he influenced people just because he had that high flying style before it was really a high flying style.
I give him that. The flying headbutt. They discussed that in episode 2. How that's just a dangerous move and no one should do it.
Well, Harley Race taught
Harley
everybody
Race
that
jacked his neck up. Dynamite Kid,
in a
was in
wheelchair.
a wheelchair in his dying days.
Right.
And when I saw Daniel Bryan start doing it, I'm like, dude, what are you doing?
But yeah, so the episode ends pretty much with the 911 call from WWE to go do a wellness check on the Benoit family since they had not been heard from. And so we open up the episode with the police officer who actually responded. That's one thing about Viceland. They find these people and bring them into the episode so you can hear it from their own words. And so they found a police officer who actually responded to the wellness call. Says he didn't know Chris Benoit that well, but he had seen him around town because of the small town he lived in Fayetteville, Georgia. And so
he said he didn't even know where he lived.
Yeah, he said
They just saw him at the gym.
Are you a detective in a town and you don't know one of the most famous people is in it?
He wasn't a detective; he's just a little officer. But yeah, he said he had seen him at the gym, but he wasn't really the most social. Chris Benoit wasn't the most social guy. He was always pretty much very intent on his workouts and being focused and getting in and getting out. And so he knew who he was, but like he said, he didn't know where he lived and he didn't know too much about him. So he responds to this call. He goes to the house. He said the dogs are out in the yard, and as he arrives, a neighbor is going up to the house. And so he's like, yeah, we got a call for a wellness check. And he's like, well, is there something you guys can do with the dogs? And they're like, oh, yeah, we take care of the dogs whenever they're out of town or whatever. So I guess the lady went into the house, and then she runs back out of the house to the officer and says, Daniel's dead. And so now the officers know that there's something wrong with this situation. And so they go into the house and they're making their way through the house. And in the series, they actually show pictures of the house. They don't show any pictures of any bodies or any blood or anything like that. They're just kind of like showing you crime scene photos of the house. The most that they show is that Chris Benoit had placed a knife under the bed of Daniel's room, which also maybe I question that. I don't know, because I have my own theories about what happened, and I'll express those in a second. But so they're going through the house and they make their way up. The first room they make their way to is they find Daniel's body in his bed, and he's face down on his bed with a Bible next to his body. Then they're making their way through the house and they find Nancy's body. They said she was like rolled up in like a carpet or a sheet or something like that with a Bible next to her body. And then they make their way into the basement, and the last room they go into is the gym area, and they said they could see in the mirror the reflection of Chris Benoit, and they're telling him to drop anything he's holding and put his hands up. And then they realize that he has hung himself using his lat pull down bar. And they describe how he pretty much murdered everybody is that he duct taped Nancy up, and they say he like broke her back, but by putting his knee in her back. He smothered his son to death, and like I just said, he hung himself with, I think they said he put like 240 pounds of weight on the lat pull down bar and let the weights drop to basically break his neck and choke himself. And like I said, they found a knife in Daniel's room under his bed, and they don't never really explain, but what I kind of feel, and this is just my opinion, because like I said, they don't really explain, but they do say that he killed Nancy first, because this happened over the course of 4 days, that he killed Nancy first on that
Friday.
Or Friday. Yeah, he killed Nancy on that Friday, and then he killed Daniel on Saturday, and then I believe it was Monday when he finally killed himself. That possibly Daniel discovered that Chris had killed his mom, and he got a knife for protection and maybe hid it under his bed to try and protect himself from his father. And, you know, obviously he's not going to be stronger than a grown man who's taking testosterone and other drugs and been drinking all weekend, because they said they found a lot of alcohol that he had consumed copious amounts of alcohol. He had research.
Plus, wasn't Daniel autistic?
I don't know about that, but
I would have sworn. Yeah, they didn't mention that. They didn't mention that in this documentary,
Yeah.
but I've read that some other place.
Yeah, I know definitely he was special. He was special needs. I don't know what, but I did notice they did not talk about that in this thing as well,
right.
which I thought was kind of weird.
And
But maybe they felt the story was heavy enough.
I was gonna say, is that
Than to say, hey, this guy murdered a special needs child of his own.
just make him
Yeah.
just make him even worse person than he already is? Which also I wanted to address that. I did like Chris Jericho in the beginning. He's saying, look, he was my friend, and he's like, I'm gonna give him praise where it needs to be. Well, he didn't say it like that, but he pretty much said, look, if you think that I'm humanizing and trying to justify what this person did, I'm not. And if you can't deal with me talking about him as a friend, like, you can stop watching now. He pretty much said that to kick off the entire show. But yeah, that's kind of what I felt happened. And then he had done some research that they found on the computers where he was looking up like angels who had brought children back from the dead, and then how to dispose of bodies. And he was even researching flights to get himself to the pay-per-view in time for the show, which just would have been wild.
Whoa, man. Okay. Yep. So Mustafa, let me throw something your way. So when the mainstream media started covering this, I know I had to answer to some people that were non-wrestling fans or whatever, because now this is in the mainstream, and now everyone's looking at pro wrestling as a business under the microscope. Did you experience any backlash from people who knew you were a pro wrestler, just having 1,000,001 questions?
Yeah, I did get a lot of questions about it, but I mean, what was weird about the whole thing is, like, at least maybe it was different for me than you guys. I don't remember a lot of these details coming out when this stuff happened. Like when they died. Like, we just knew over the weekend he had killed all three of them, and it was never told. Okay, it was Nancy on one day, Daniel on another day, him on another day. It made it seem like everything happened at the same time. There, all I heard is that there was Bibles and stuff like that. They went and did a whole Raw pretty much praising the guy, not knowing that he had did all these murders and suicide, thinking somebody murdered them and killed him. And so I think it was SmackDown on Thursdays at that point.
Yeah, but they recorded on Tuesdays.
Okay,
that's why they said the next night.
Yeah, and then they found out that happened. It was like, oh, well, we're not going to mention this guy again. This is truly what happened. Fuck that guy. We're we're moving on with our lives. So, like, when people ask me questions, like now I can probably answer it better, but then they didn't tell us much.
Yeah, I know around that time, the first things I heard was that carbon monoxide, because everybody in the house was dead, that it could have been carbon monoxide poisoning. So as a kid, first I ran with that. Then it was like, oh, it looks like it might have been like a hit by like the Japanese mafia or something like that, because Chris Benoit owed them money or something. And that was the next one that I heard. And then finally you heard Chris Benoit killed his whole family, which at that time I'm like, no, no way. I don't believe that. Like that doesn't make any sense. Like, also I was young. My mind, I couldn't comprehend how somebody could do any of that. And now, even looking back, like I said, I got emotional during this because I'm a father now, and I just could never imagine doing that at all to my son.
Having to kill your own son, yeah, your own flesh and blood.
Let me ask you too, in your opinion, because they said that Nancy and Benoit must have had some sort of altercation. What do you think sparked it? I have my thoughts. I just want to hear y'all's first.
I just think it's something that was just building up for a long time. Because, like, I think they said they found certain stuff in his journal that was kind of letting them know that something was wrong. And, how they said he started acting after Eddie Guerrero's death, that he was always kind of weird from that point on. And so I think it was kind of escalating. And I think it probably was something minor. It was probably something like, hey, why you didn't wash the dishes this morning, or why you didn't take the garbage out before you, went to bed, like, normal husband wife stuff. And then he was like, you know what? Fuck it.
Well, I don't know. I know
You
they
know,
said that weekend they had a barbecue and they had people over and everything like that and were relaxing at the pool. And later on, he said that's when the argument happened and he bound her with duct tape and everything like that, and then choked her with the telephone cord and broke her back with his knee in it. I,
Okay.
and then they talked about the text messages that she had been sending Chris about, look, I'm getting tired of your steroid abuse and having the short temper and everything like that and going off. The only thing that I could imagine, and I really don't want to speculate on what it was because I don't even think it's important because you took it to a level that it did not need to be escalated to. But the only thing I can think of is that she's like, look, I'm done. I'm leaving you and I'm taking the kid with me. That's that's the
I 100% agree because that's exactly what I was thinking. Just the manner that he killed her, like if they had just an argument and he just smacked her up or whatever, just choked her. Okay, that's kind of like a fit of rage, but you took the time to bind her with duct tape and then you choked her with a phone cord with your knee in her back to the point where you broke it. That sounds like I'm leaving you, and he's one of those. Okay, okay. So
I can't have
me and
you, can't
Mustafa
nobody else
has,
have you.
yeah, me and Mustafa has spoke about how grimy the business is, and let's think about how him and Nancy hooked up. Now, how much trust do you think he had in her?
Hmm.
I think you're correct. I think that she might have just been like, "Look, I've had enough." In his paranoid state, he probably thought there was another man involved. And yeah, if I can't have you, no one can. I think he killed her. And from what I heard, he probably realized that, look, I'm going to jail. That means Daniel's going to have to probably go in the home or whatever. I think he kind of, I hate to say this, but he kind of like was a mercy killing. Like he just wanted to just like didn't want Daniel to live with the fact that his dad killed his mom, so he offed him as well. And then it just got so bad for him that he just killed himself.
I now that you said it out loud, I can foresee it happening, but I also can see it happening of something small too. Because I mean, granted, I don't recall any toxicology reports coming out, but if he was still using antibiotic steroids at that
No,
Ten
point,
times.
the
it is.
toxicology report did come out. They mentioned that in the documentary. They said that he had 10 times the amount of testosterone that a normal man of his size, weight, and height
Oh yeah, that's right.
should
That's right.
have.
Jesus, 10 times.
That's right. They did say that. So it could have easily been something small because people when they are on that stuff,
But
it's
okay,
shit like that.
But
But
Mustafa, you just okay. If in a roid rage, you start throwing them hands. You don't tie a motherfucker up with some damn duct tape.
I mean, true, but you know what? Everybody's reactions are different.
That
But I mean,
that sounded
it makes
malicious.
more sense what you said. It makes more sense, and then I agree. It probably was a situation was like, okay, well, I just killed the wife slash mother of my children, and our child, and he's special needs, and now he doesn't have a mom, and is not gonna have a dad because I'm killing myself or I'm going to jail.
Mhm.
So yeah, I'm gonna do what's quote unquote right for my son, and then took him out and then took himself out. No matter what way you look at it, it's a fucked up situation.
Very to the point
And
where.
I think, oh, I'm sorry.
Go
I think
ahead.
it's one of those things that just kept escalating. Because I mean, we've all been there where we get to a point of no return, and you just got to keep going at that point. And I think maybe he grabbed and tied up Nancy and was like, "Oh shit." And then he was like, "Well, I guess I got to continue." Like,
Just man, I just can't think the just Lord, he broke her back.
Yeah,
Not in a good way.
the one thing I wish they had brought up in the series, and they brought it up kind of on the after series. I forgot what it's called, but they do like a post show with people like it's like at the dark side of the ring after dark or something like
After the
that.
dark or something after dark,
Yeah,
something like that.
but like you were talking about the media and how they were just all over this, and it was anabolic steroids this and roid rage that, and they didn't show or bring up the Nancy Grace things that she said that were just terrible about Chris Benoit. And like we seen an interview with David Benoit where he brings up those things, and just I just couldn't imagine being the child of Chris Benoit to pretty much, to add some levity to this, the boy who lived as being David Benoit, who has to live in the shadow of your father who did these things and be of school age and having to deal with not just the media but kids who are just cruel, and growing up in the internet age where he brought up, and also Chavo Guerrero brought up that every time David Benoit said every time he goes online to like hop on live on Instagram or something like that, you got people in there just trolling him, talking about your dad's a killer and you're probably gonna do the same thing one day, and
Damn.
and crapping on him, and Chavo saying that people just come on his post and leave comments like the dogs are in the enclosed pool area and the door is open.
This is why people ain't shit.
And I just couldn't imagine having to deal with that for my life. And David Benoit talking about how he wants to be a wrestler, and to have the name Benoit and to look so much like your dad, and to essentially just be blackballed from the business because of something that you had nothing to do with. You weren't even living with that man. You were pretty much across the world. He was still living in Canada.
Look, I- if I could say one thing to David Benoit, I would tell him, bro, I'm just gonna be real with you. You don't want no part of this business. I think this is a wrong move for him. I can understand him trying to, I don't know, like recover his father's fallen legacy. But dude, there's a big ass blemish on you that is not your fault. This business is not for you.
Well, one thing I want to say, that kid's not even trained, so I don't even want him to think about getting in a wrestling ring. And if he does need to change his name. He can't go into wrestling
He
as a
can't.
David
He'd have to
Benoit.
be under a hood. He'd have to wrestle under a hood at this point.
I told you he looks like Mean Mark Calloway, so he could be Mean Dave or something.
This is what I was going to say, too, based off something that Tru Element said like 10 minutes ago about media. And what sucks about the media, and especially back in those days, I say that like that was a long time ago, but kind of is, kind of isn't, um, is that the media, man, they love it when they can put a black guy on wrestling, boy, I tell you. You don't hear anything about all the stuff they do with like charities, what's the one they do every year for?
Fish and the Nancy, not the Nancy Kerrigan.
Susie
Yeah,
Coleman.
Susan Mika Coleman.
yeah, like you don't never hear them doing anything about stuff like that. But oh my God, let somebody get a ticket or let somebody, have a domestic violence case or something. The media is always all on it. Like they had a field day with this David Benoit, who professional wrestler Chris Benoit killed his whole entire family.
Roid rage.
Fuck everything else he did. We could just say fuck everything else he did in the wrestling business. That was great. We could talk about all the people that he mentored and made better wrestlers just because he was who he was. Now, I'm not justifying that makes what he did right, but come the fuck on, media. Sorry, got a little heated about it.
Well, I'm going to bring up something, but I want to ask you guys a question because it was mentioned in here. They spoke with Matthew Randazzo, the author of Ring of Hell, the story of Chris Benoit and the fall of the pro wrestling industry. And they talked about how the WWE had the wellness policy put in place after Eddie Guerrero's passing. And in the documentary, you had Chris Jericho talking about how serious the drug testing policies and wellness policies were. But then on the opposite side, you had this Matthew Randazzo guy and Sandy and other people just talking about how the wellness policy was a joke and that it wasn't taken serious. People could still pass. And they even mentioned that Chris Benoit passed all his drug tests and wellness policy tests, even though the toxicology came back and said, hey, I don't know how this guy was passing yet 10 times the amount of testosterone in his body that he should have had. But
Well, from what I understand, they were testing for testosterone, and they at that point was not testing for HGH. You probably know a little bit more about that because you're more into bodybuilding. But is that something that you have to test separately?
I'm not into it like that,
Oh,
but like testosterone, that's the one thing. Like testosterone itself is not just is like you can have TRT treatment. So maybe he had a prescription because Chris Jericho said you even had to have a prescription just to take an aspirin or whatever. And we see nowadays, maybe it is more strict nowadays, but you see people who are on like Ritalin or whatever it was that they said Roman Reigns was taking and he got popped. But again, I believe it did get more strict after Chris Benoit because you can even just see it in the performers that we have these days. The majority of them have no muscle mass.
Chris
Listen,
Masters
depending on
shrunk after that.
Yeah,
listen, it all depends on who you are. We all know it depends on who you are in the WWE. Sorry, not trying to throw shade, but you think The Rock ever was gonna fail a wellness test if he was taking something? Not saying he
Randy
was.
Orton,
You, Randy Orton,
Triple H,
yep, Stone Cold Steve Austin.
John Cena.
You best believe now. If you anybody under them, yeah, you'll get popped. Some of you'll get popped. Just to set an example. But if you are the top star, is Vince McMahon getting tested? Probably not.
But see, that's why. Which wife said it? Was it Vicky Guerrero said that the wellness policy is a joke?
yeah.
It's an absolute joke.
And then again, like I said, you can get prescriptions for things like testosterone replacement therapy from a doctor and everything like that. And it can be prescribed to you, and who knows that they don't make what the wellness policy really is made public, but there are ways. I would imagine there's ways around it, and typically once you've done steroids, you pretty much have to stay on steroids for pretty much the rest of your life. If you don't want to look like shit, you have to stay on it in some shape, form, or fashion because
You know, there was one point because another person I just thought of who probably got away with testing, allegedly, was Kurt Angle. And when he was in TNA, it got to the point where it's just like, my God, I hope we don't have another Benoit situation. Like, I was really concerned about Kurt Angle because I thought he was spiraling just like Benoit was.
But what I wanted to ask you guys, just based on the title of his book, and this was around the time you guys were getting into the industry, did you guys kind of just feel like this is the end? Like, I don't know if wrestling makes it past this. Oh,
No, I wasn't really concerned about the business not continuing. I definitely thought what shit was going to change, although it's the Wild Wild West on the Indies. Don't nobody drug test or anything like that. I mean, I could probably, if I wanted steroids, I probably could get them. You know what I'm saying? So pills, again, not gonna call no names, but some people be in the back in the locker room. Not so much now.
let me
When
tell
we
you, like
started, like, hey,
superstar.
you got any gimmicks?
Let me tell you about like superstar Billy Graham. I suggest you go and take those, or else you're never going to beat Devin August.
That's why I'm called the natural. I don't need steroids.
But
You're
But
gonna
yeah, I
need
didn't.
something. No, I'm just kidding.
you're going to need some of Michael Jordan's secret stuff. But
Anyway,
Xavier Mustafa, how did you feel about the industry at this time, or just basically just both of you? Did you see actually any changes on the independents because of what happened with Chris Benoit?
no.
No.
Okay.
I think it probably was something that was in the back of a lot of people's minds, and I think it kind of made you look at certain people a certain way because I mean, I remember one time early in my career where I had an interaction with a guy who was obviously on steroids that flipped out, and I was just like, "Whoa, hold on, buddy, calm down. I'm not the one." But you see that, and you like know what the consequences of those potential things. Yeah.
You know, I'm not going to name any names, but if he would ever want to talk to us and discuss this, um, we can bring it up again. But Eddie would probably know who I'm talking about. Someone, now that I think about it, I think this is around the time he started getting out of the business because he had a bit of an addiction that he was working through and cleaned himself up. But I think the Benoit thing did hit a certain people. It was like more or less like a wake up call. If the whole Eddie Guerrero death wasn't a wake up call, because it's just like, my God, you dropped dead at 38. I'm 39 now. I can't imagine dropping dead. But I haven't abused my body either. But I think, yeah, if it wasn't a wake up call with Eddie Guerrero's death, I think definitely Chris Benoit's death probably got some people like, look, I need to change, otherwise I might be in the same boat.
Right.
But you know, it just goes to what True Element was talking about earlier when he was talking about, how people don't want to report that, they're hurt because they're afraid somebody's going to take their spot. It's the same thing with steroids, stuff like that. They really got to look a certain way. They got to perform a certain way. So that makes them want to use drugs. Even though they maybe not really want to, and they see the side effects and they see that they're snapping off and losing their damn mind, but they're like, you know what, I got to make this money at the end of the day, so I'm just going to deal with it and deal with the consequences later. And then when you deal with the consequences, shit like this happens.
Right.
And you know what? WWE isn't exactly got their hands clean, because I remember when a certain somebody was being scouted by the WWE and they wanted him to put on some more muscle mass. They specifically said, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but you need to, put on some more mass.
Oh, so that's why you only got your head shaved. That explains a lot. But yeah, back like we were talking about with the media, it was a media circus around this. WWE was in the hot seat. You could tell Vince McMahon did not want to do these interviews. You had 2 dead wrestlers on your watch in pretty much less than 18 months.
Yeah.
And it just wasn't a good look. And both young wrestlers, and nobody could explain. And like I said, they were blaming on steroids and everything. And he's like, we got the wellness policy. People were saying the wellness policy was a joke. Toxicology comes back pretty much proving that the wellness policy was a joke. But then a former WWE wrestler by the name of Chris Nowinski, he had started a clinic or institution. He has his doctorate, and he had started the Concussion Legacy Foundation, and they had began studying the brain and how brain injuries could affect behavior and your life after whatever sport or whatever it is that causes traumatic brain injury to you, like what damage it does in the long run, because he was forced into early retirement due to having like 6 concussions in a short span of time. And so this is around the time that, as we know it to be known today, and it was bubbling up back then because there were like 4 NFL stars that had been discovered in, called CTE. And that's when they started to, he says, hey, he contacted the family to see if they would let them study Chris Benoit's brain to see if there were any markers in there for CTE. And they found that there were markers in there and that his brain had deteriorated to the point where they said he had the brain functions of like an 80 or 90-year-old man. And, you have some people who argue, well, if he had the brain function of that, like, there's no way he could strangle and kill people or whatever, but that doesn't take away your strength. It just means you're not able to think cognitively, like, adept or whatever. But yeah, so they discovered that in his head, and there's a lot of wrestlers talking about how, yeah, back then and all through the 80s and pretty much throughout wrestling's history, that it was a sign of toughness to get a concussion and you keep going, or to take those steel chair shots to the head, and he's like, you just brace and stiffen up and you just take your lumps. And they started showing highlights from how malicious a lot of those chair shots used to be. I'm shocked they didn't show The Rock just beating the hell out of Mankind.
Dude,
because I will never forget when I met Cody Rhodes years ago, and we were talking about that, and this is when I didn't know anything about the business, or at least as much as I thought. I always like, oh, those chair shots got to be fake. Those ain't real chairs. Nobody's doing that. Nobody's that dumb. He's like, no, those are real chairs. Like, we take real chair shots. And I'm like,
we had this conversation like way back when on our podcast where me and Mustafa talked about, taking chair shots. And it's just like, I've only taken a handful of them for that exact same reason. It's just like, I'm not trying to, be like Muhammad Ali, and not be able to play with my kids when they get old, when they get older or whatever, play with my grandchildren whenever they have them. To the point where I think taking chair shots to the head is very taboo nowadays. Even on the indie scene, a lot of times people try to stray away from it. I had a match probably about less than a year ago against a guy named Jack Spade, and I trust Jack Spade, and I knew a chair shot was coming, so I didn't put my hand up, and he cracked me with it, but he did it safely, and the guys in the back were just like, "Dude, I can't believe you just took that full on." I'm just like, "Well, I trust Jack. I know he's not gonna try to take my head off with it." So there's a lot of trust that goes into swinging chair shots these days.
Listen, you talk about that trust thing. I told you about the TC Washington incident and the fact that I can't drink out of regular cups anymore.
You might want to go see the doctor.
He caught me with one too. He must have just put a little more umph in yours.
Man, the the everything.
Xavier Mustafa owed him $350.
I must have.
Did you pay him yet?
I don't remember.
Oh man. But yeah, so we go from that to WWE pretty much erasing Chris Benoit from history. His name's not to be uttered. They talk to Jim Ross, they talk to Chris Jericho, they talk to Dean Malenko, and they pretty much have the argument that's been going on in professional wrestling ever since Chris Benoit's death. And they talk about how you have these two guys, two of the greatest of their generation, best friends, came up in the industry, pretty much all the same accolades. They follow the same blueprint. Yet one gets all of his praises and all of his dues and is in the Hall of Fame, and he's going to get this. And the other one is erased from history. Like he was never there. He never did anything for the industry. And even Chris Jericho talks about how he would always tell Chris Benoit to go take a break and take some time off and go spend the holidays with your family and with your kids. You're missing out on all these different things. And Chris Benoit would never take him up on it because his first love was wrestling and everything else came second. And they even talk about how when they memorialized Chris Benoit before all the facts came out, you got everybody on there praising him and talking about how great he is and how much they love him. And like, I think Chavo Guerrero's like, I trust you with my children. I trust you with my life and everything. And then all the facts come out and they said the one person who cut pretty much an ominous memorialized Chris Benoit very ominously was William Regal. And they said William Regal lived in pretty much the same town as Chris Benoit. So he had seen some of the confrontations and the arguments and the behaviors of Chris Benoit. So maybe he knew something that everybody else didn't know because he got to see Chris Benoit when he wasn't around the boys and having to put on the business face and be professional. Because they said Chris Benoit was, no matter what was going on, he was always an utmost professional, which makes it even more like shocking on the what if he had done everything that he did and shown up to that pay-per-view to perform. Like that's like a psychopath. Like if he could put on a professional face and still go out there and put on a great match and then all this stuff comes out. But William Regal pretty much just said he's a hard worker. He works hard. And he didn't really heap any praise on him at all. He just like
So during my time when I was wrestling down in Tennessee, there was this I guess you could say it's a code. And it's a way that you tell a wrestler, or it's how you describe a wrestler that's a shitty wrestler. You would describe to that person as being a nice guy. So they'll be like, hey, how is this person as a wrestler? And you're like, yeah, he's a nice guy. Yeah, but how's his wrestling work? He's a nice guy. And it was kind of the same situation you were just saying there with Steven Regal, like, yeah, he's a hard worker. Mm-hmm. He's a nice guy. I want to bring up something that happened. Like whenever we're talking about this, I thought it was kind of bogus because WWE they do a lot of bogus stuff, and I thought this was real bogus. I mean, granted, I understand that from a company standpoint, they have to say this is not cool. We're not going to, put this guy over but they didn't need to cut him out of everything because he was an integral part in a lot of stuff around that time. You can kind of see now that they kind of edit around him. Now they're slowly but surely not editing around him as much. You may get a clip of him taking a 619 or a clip of him taking a move or something. They doing it that way. But to not send anybody to his funeral but JR.
And nobody contacted none of the family except for Jericho and Chavo.
And I did want to bring that up. That was where I was going next. Was like how Sandy said she confronted JR because she felt they were working an angle. And in my head, I'm like, maybe being emotional, you would think that, but I look at it from the other way that Jim Ross was the reason that Chris Benoit was in the WWE. Like he brought this guy in. You know how the JR pretty much brought everybody in. So to go there and pay his respects. But another thing I found kind of shocking about that, because it was like nobody from WWE, but at this time, Chris Jericho was still in the WWE. So it made me wonder, because they didn't address if Chris Jericho was at the funeral. So I wonder if he was even there, because he did mention that they'd asked him to be a part of the memorial on Raw, and he had declined to participate in that as well, which was also kind of surprising just because of it being his very good friend Chris Benoit. It was just a lot of strange coincidences, like in this part of the story, in my opinion, that I found kind of peculiar.
Yeah, nobody but JR. Like that's kind of bullshit.
Yeah, but also like you said, not to reach out to any of the family.
Right, like they took care of
Vicky
Guerrero. Yeah, right. When Eddie died, like they are known for making sure families are right when stuff like this happens. And just because Chris Benoit was the one that actually did what he did to his family, to not take care of other family members, I think was total bullshit.
But okay, so I'm going to play the devil's advocate. I'm going to be Mustafa for a second. But you have to understand that by detaching himself from anything associated with Benoit, that kind of stops people from finding no means to attack them. So when they brought up that whether or not Nancy should be included in the Hall of Fame, because I mean, let's just be real, Chris Benoit never will be in it. But Nancy, the subject of Nancy being into the Hall of Fame, I don't know if that will happen, because I think you gotta kind of think Chris Benoit when you think of Nancy. So by no fault of her own.
You know what? I don't. Because anytime I think of Nancy, I think of, granted, because I was a big WCW fan, I always think of woman. I always think of her time as woman.
And Chris Jericho brought that up. He was like, she could never go in as Nancy Benoit, but he would like to see woman go in. And it also made me think, is Kevin Sullivan in the WWE Hall of Fame?
I don't think so.
So they could go in together if they ever want to do Kevin Sullivan.
Yeah, that's how they do it. Like they kind of slid China in there. They might do Kevin Sullivan's group.
Yeah.
Wait, the Dungeon of Doom? I said the Dungeon of Doom?
Is that what they were called? I wasn't a fan.
I mean, I can't tell you how many times, like as a kid, I used to mark out for Ric Flair saying, "Woman, oh woman, won't you marry me now?"
So have either
that's
one
all new to me. I'm not familiar. I mean, I know who she was, but I'm not familiar with the woman character.
This is throwing something out there that I should have brought up earlier. Have either one of you met Kevin Sullivan?
I have not.
Not directly.
Okay, because I know
he's been up here for a couple of shows out in Waukesha.
Yeah, I know Sean Priest said he met him. He said that's who granted him the rights to do the Sean Priest character that he does in BCW. So.
Oh yeah, he'll find the evil character for you. Him and Tyler Sullivan. He's very good at that dark stuff.
Gimmick.
You said what, Chris Black?
They rocking the hell out that gimmick. I love it.
I like his ICW persona a little bit more, and Xavier Mustafa knows why. I like that Sean Priest.
Because it's black and racist.
Yeah, he's the Tyrone of ICW. He's just here He's just here to fuck your wife, like Bobby Lashley. But yeah, so the documentary pretty much from the Chris Benoit funeral, his erasing from history, we kind of leave WWE. And I did, before I even move on, I wanted to give a shout out to Viceland because they purely try to keep it about what the story is really about, because there was just a lot more going on at the time that if they wanted to kind of turn into a hit piece and get off topic, and like they could have talked about how Vince McMahon had done the death angle in WWE at this time, where his limo had blown up the previous week and it was supposed to be a fake death on television, and now Vince has to come out of hiding and cancel that storyline because it's a real death. And then you find out that this man did all of this, and now WWE is under the gun because they were doing a fake death angle, and now they got a real death angle, and they're playing with death. Like, there was a lot of other ways that this Viceland episode could have went, but I gotta salute them for just keeping it focused on Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, and on the families and those who actually suffered, instead of trying to bury everybody else around this time and WWE as a company. So salute to them for being able to balance that.
I know I brought this up in a prior episode, but I really feel that Eddie Guerrero kind of gets slighted in this because his story got told within this bigger story of Chris Benoit when he really could have deserved his own story on its own. But because they did this so well, I'm not going to be too mad about it, because I did think they didn't slack on that part of the story.
The only reason, well, let me say this real quick. The only reason I feel that it's kind of done that way is because Eddie Guerrero's story has been told, and it's been told through WWE. They can't tell a better story than the story of redemption that Eddie Guerrero had in his wrestling career. Chris Benoit's story would never get told by anybody, and so this was the opportunity to do it the right way, I guess you could say, without just completely demonizing him.
Well, I definitely think that Eddie Guerrero should have had his own episode. But they, like I said, all the hard hitting parts were told in this one. If they were going to do a Viceland episode of Eddie Guerrero, I would like for them to cover the time period when he was kicked out of WWE, what he did leading up to coming back, because some of his work on the Indies, if you've seen any footage of that, it was some good work. And maybe the story of his redemption to come back, maybe that's something that they can talk about.
Yeah, WWE's told that story. That's what I'm saying, is that those stories are the ones that could be told because he hasn't been erased from history. You think about all the stories that Viceland has told to us besides the Montreal Screwjob, and later on in the season we're going to have a brawl for it all, are stories that WWE is never going to tell. You're never going to get a Bruiser Brody documentary out of WWE. You're never gonna get the Diva Bravo story. You're never gonna get the
New Jack.
Yeah, you're never gonna get the New Jack, the Jimmy Snuka. You're never gonna get any. You're not gonna get those from WWE. But Eddie Guerrero, WWE can go and do that story tomorrow if they wanted to do it that way. But they talked about his redemption and the drugs and all that type of stuff because it was a storybook ending, not for necessarily his life dying in a hotel bathroom, but just his story of redemption of having all the drug abuse, finding God, getting fired, going to rehab, coming back clean, and being on top of the world. So I think that's why they kind of just slid him in here, because they're like, we're not gonna be able to tell a better story than all the stuff that's already out there about Eddie Guerrero.
In your opinion, I know this is neither here nor there at this point, but if Eddie Guerrero would not have passed, do you think this would have happened?
No. But I do think that Nancy would have probably, her and Chris would have probably gotten divorced, but I think he would have had somebody to lean on. He lost his best friend in the world. And now, if what we were saying is true, that Nancy told him that she was going to leave, he's gonna lose the last person, the only other person he loved as much as Eddie Guerrero, and that would make you snap. Like, now you're gonna leave me. Eddie leaves me, and now you're gonna leave me.
Right.
We're gonna go be one big happy family in heaven.
Not so sure that's where he's going, but
Hey, he probably repented. Remember, all you gotta do is ask for forgiveness. That's what they say.
I'm not touching that.
Yeah, but oh yeah, and that was something we forgot to mention. They did say he did leave a suicide note as well. It was pretty much said, "I'm preparing to leave this earth," and that was found.
Yeah, you just did not take two people with you, but
Yeah, and that was found in the Bible. So, moving on from them finding the CTE and having the funeral and everything, and it was a small private funeral. They didn't even tell anybody where it was going to be and when it was going to be. Now we're pretty much done with anything to do with the WWE, and the documentary pretty much takes a turn where Sandy's talking about how the WWE never reached out to her. Dave is talking about how they never reached out to him. Nobody ever did. The only people that they heard from was Chris Jericho and Chavo. And even the families, the Benoit family and Nancy's family, had even split, where they were telling David that that Nancy's family didn't want anything to do with him, and at the same time they're telling Nancy's family that David doesn't want anything to do with them. And so they lost that connection. And in this documentary, it ends up with a happy ending with Chris Jericho reuniting David with his aunt, Sandy, at a AEW event, and them exchanging phone numbers and enjoying the show together. And so it has a happy ending with these two families that had been having to grieve with a bunch of intermediaries, because David always talked about how Chris Jericho stayed in his life or whatever, but Chris Jericho lost a friend but not a family member, and only that's a pain that only David and Sandy and those two families could share in that grief and understand from one another. So him reuniting them, you got to salute Chris Jericho. And Chris Jericho does a lot of charity work and a lot of help for people all throughout wrestling and outside of wrestling, but especially inside of wrestling, on just being an all-around good guy. I don't hear anything negative about Chris Jericho ever. So,
And he gets points for kicking Goldberg's ass in my book.
have you guys ever heard anything about negative about Chris Jericho?
nope.
Nothing at all. No ego. Not trying to, not put people over. Not having a bad attitude. There's nothing bad I've ever heard of Chris Jericho.
So, yeah, that's pretty much how the documentary ends. Like, there's not too much more to really speak on. Like I said, my impressions were that this was a really heavy way to open the season, and we're gonna have another heavy episode to pretty much close the series. It's gonna be tragic, but it's gonna be based on an individual, because we're starting out with this Chris Benoit story, and you have two deaths and the death of a child. And then at the end of the season, the final episode is going to be the death of Owen Hart, which is going to be heavy for a completely different reason, just because it was these were senseless killings. That's just going to be a completely nonsensical death that when we get to that in the Over the Edge pay-per-view, because I had ordered that pay-per-view, I was watching that live when that happened.
Yep.
And I ordered that for my birthday, but we're going to get there when we get to that final episode. The next episode is going to be covering Chris Black's next challenger after he loses Devin August, New Jack.
Please. I'm gonna have TC bringing me a gun.
New
He ain't
Jack
stabbing me.
New Jack catches bullets with his teeth. You know that, right?
I'm gonna take a powder.
But yeah, you guys got anything else to say about this episode? The first two episodes of Dark Side of the Ring season 2? Excited about the rest of the season?
Hell yeah. Once again, I don't think we can give Viceland enough props. They have gone out of their way to provide some of the best documentaries ever with this Dark Side of the Ring series. I'm I'm just completely blown away each episode. I really hope they continue to season 3, 4, whatever. So, well, I don't know. If you start stretching it that far, maybe they're going to start picking some less than stellar stories. But I mean, there's plenty of stories in the business. So, keep up the good work, Viceland. Mr. Mustafa.
I ain't got nothing. I had something, but I wasn't able to say it, so I'm good.
You mad, bro?
I didn't steal your thunder, did I?
No, somebody
Oh,
else did. As they
Oh
always
my
do.
God! Here we go. Here we go. Go ahead. What was you gonna say?
No, I can't say it now. It was a great transition, but you spoiled it, so I can't say it now.
What was
So
it? Go
it will
ahead.
die with me. No, I'm good. See everybody next week, ladies and gentlemen. We talk about New Jack.
You wanna go ahead and plug your new project that you got out there?
Sure, because probably by the time this airs, everything should be good on iTunes and Stitcher and Spotify and all of the great places you get your podcasts. So the same place you get Saturday Night Slamcasters, you can also subscribe to my own podcast, which is called XM Cinema. It's going to be where I'll be reviewing certain reality shows, TV shows, and movies. So just give a search for that, XM Cinema.
All right.
nice.
Go ahead and finish that with your social media.
And you can catch me at Xavier Mustafa on Facebook and on Twitter, and at XM Cinema on Facebook and on Twitter.
You can find me at The Natural Chris Black on Facebook and Instagram, and at _natural_CB on Twitter.
And let me take that back. I lied. I'm not on Facebook with XM Cinema. I'm on Instagram with XM Cinema. So that's right. The only Xavier Mustafa on Instagram is XM Cinema.
And since I just heard about that now, I'm going to go ahead and find you.
Right.
And I'm working on becoming an Instagram model, so make sure you follow and like my pics. And then I'm going to start a fans only once I get popular. Thank you.
And you can catch me at Slamcaster TE78 over there on the Twitter. You can find us wherever you get your podcast from. Just search us on your iTunes, your Stitcher, your Spotify, and subscribe to Saturday Night Slamcasters, or you can find us by typing in hashtag Come Get Slam. Be sure to keep giving us likes, comments, hitting that subscribe button, and leaving us a thumbs up. Our next episode, like I said before, is going to be covering episode 3 of the Viceland Dark Side of the Ring series, and that is going to be covering New Jack. That's going to be dropping on Wednesday, May 17th, June 17th, 2020. So make sure that you're subscribed and that you've hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of our uploads. Also, go back and enjoy our other reviews, especially covering season 1 of Dark Side of the Ring, covering the Ruthless Aggression era, and all of our other reviews for pay-per-views and interviews that are here on the YouTube page. Other than that, holla at your boys. We up out of here. Come get slammed. Peace.